There is a version of the Rick and Morty pilot that never made it to air. In it, Rick fires up the portal gun for the first time on screen, and it sneezes out canned corn niblets and a dead weatherman before Morty, left to his own devices in the garage, welds together spare parts and accidentally builds a dinosaur that just wanders off into the night. None of that is in the episode you have seen. Adult Swim swapped it out before broadcast, and it turns out that scene is just the first thread in a much longer reel of Rick and Morty that never reached your screen. Deleted scenes, a scrapped episode 2 of the show's own creators refused to describe, a full baby-voiced redub of one of its most beloved hours, jokes that got quietly rewritten between broadcast and rerun, and a small pile of retcons hiding in plain sight across 9 seasons. Almost nobody talks about all of that material in one single place. Tonight, we're going through it together. From a 2006 student film you have never heard of to the coded protest chant one recent episode apparently smuggled past its own network, this is Paper Town. And if you're here specifically to fall asleep, this suits the format perfectly. So get comfortable, we'll be here a while, and if you haven't subscribed, it really does help us keep making these. Rick and Morty did not begin with Rick or with Morty. It began with a Back to the Future parody made for almost no money by a college-adjacent filmmaker who did not yet have a television deal, a development executive, or a studio behind him. In 2006, Justin Roiland made a short called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty for Channel 101, the Los Angeles Short Film Festival and screening series that functioned for a certain generation of alternative comedy writers as something between a talent platform and a proving ground. The short starred a scientist named Doc Smith and his put-upon young sidekick Marty McDonald's, cast more like a reluctant student stuck with a reckless mentor than the family duo they would later become. And even those clumsy names looked almost deliberate on the page. Which was the point? Roiland has said outright that he built the characters around doing bad impressions of Doc and Marty from Back to the Future, and the names were altered specifically so nobody at Universal would have grounds to come after a broke 20-something for trademark infringement. It worked. Nobody sued a Channel 101 short nobody outside the festival had heard of. What matters about Doc and Marty is not that it is a lost pilot in any technical sense, because it isn't one. It is a standalone student-adjacent short with its own ending, but that it is the actual point of origin for everything that came after. The dynamic that would eventually become Rick and Morty, an unstable older scientist dragging a nervous younger relative into increasingly reckless situations, existed here first, years before Adult Swim, years before Dan Harmon, years before the words interdimensional cable meant anything to anyone. If you go looking for the franchise's true first episode, the honest answer is that it isn't the 2013 pilot everyone quotes. It's a crude, cheaply made parody sketch built to dodge a lawsuit, which is a strange thing to say about one of the most successful animated shows of the last decade, but it happens to be true. The other half of the origin story is a coincidence of timing that could very easily not have happened. Roiland and Dan Harmon knew each other through that same Channel 101 scene, the kind of loose, overlapping community of alternative comedy writers and filmmakers in Los Angeles who all seemed to cross paths at some point before any of them were famous. For a while, that relationship was just an acquaintance, one more name in a shared circle. Then Harmon, who by that point had built and was running Community for NBC, was fired from his own show. That firing is a separate story, tangled up in on-set conflicts that don't belong in this video. But the relevant fact here is narrower and simpler. Getting pushed off Community in 2012 freed up time and headspace that Harmon did not previously have, and it was in that window that he reconnected with Roiland. That reconnection is what actually kicked off real development on what would become Rick and Morty. Without the firing, there is a real chance this show does not exist in the form we know it, or does not exist at all, which is an uncomfortable thing to sit with for a show this beloved, that its existence runs partly through someone else's bad year. It's worth pausing on how thin that thread actually is. A parody short made to avoid a lawsuit, screened at a scrappy Los Angeles festival, remembered by exactly the right person at exactly the right moment because his other show fell apart. None of the pieces individually look like the beginning of a franchise that would eventually get a 70-episode order from a cable network. That's the honest starting point for tonight. Not a mythologized creation story where two visionaries sat down and designed Rick and Morty from first principles, but a much scrappier, more accidental chain of events. A bad Back to the Future impression that happened to land in front of the one person who would know exactly what to do with it years later. That accidental quality carries straight into the next stage of the story. Because the version you know, a grandfather and grandson locked into a family sitcom structure, was not Roiland's original plan either. His first instinct, going into development, was to keep Rick and Morty as two unrelated guys, something closer to next-door neighbors or mismatched friends than family, which tracks if you think about where the idea came from. Doc and Marty weren't written as blood relatives so much as an unstable mentor and the kid unlucky enough to be nearby. But Adult Swim wanted more than an 11-minute short. They wanted a genuine half-hour show, and a half-hour show needs a sturdier engine than two guys who happen to hang out. According to reporting on the show's development, it was an Adult Swim executive, Nick Wiedenfeld, who pushed the idea that would actually hold that engine together, make them family. Specifically, make Rick the grandfather. Sit with that for a second, because it is a strange thing to realize about a show this identity defined by its family structure. The entire emotional architecture of Rick and Morty, Beth's complicated love for a father who abandoned her, Jerry's constant humiliation in his own house, Summer angling for Rick's approval, Morty's whole arc of growing a spine under pressure from a man he's biologically stuck with, none of that exists in Roiland's original pitch. It was added, apparently by a network executive doing exactly what network executives are supposed to do, which is push a creator toward a format that can sustain 22 minutes a week instead of 11 once in a while. It is easy to imagine an alternate version of this show, unrelated Rick and Morty, neighbors instead of family. And it is hard to picture that version generating anything like the same emotional weight seasons later when Rick has to watch Beth ask him, more than once, whether she is the clone or the original. Family made stakes possible that friendship alone probably couldn't have carried. This is interpretation, not fact, so it's worth saying plainly, nobody can prove the Friends Not Family version would have failed, and the record doesn't include a scrapped season of Rick and Morty Just Some Guys for anyone to compare against. What we do know from the reporting on this period is that the structural choice, which now feels inevitable, obviously the correct call. The only way this concept could have worked was actually a suggestion bolted on during the pitch process to satisfy a network's format requirements. Sometimes the load-bearing wall of a show isn't in the original blueprint. Sometimes it gets added by the contractor. Once the family structure was locked in, the pilot itself still had to survive a round of network notes. And one of those notes nearly cost Justin Roiland the role that would define the next decade of his career. According to Roiland's own account, given years later, Cartoon Network and Adult Swim executives loved almost everything about the pilot. They liked the story, they liked the tone, they liked the world. What they didn't like was Morty. Specifically, they didn't like how Roiland had voiced him the first time through, a performance he's described as whinier and more theatrical than what ended up on screen. Dan Harmon had to be the one to deliver that news, and by Roiland's telling the conversation was blunt, they loved the pilot, they don't like the voices, we've got to recast, specifically for Morty. Think about what that means for a second. The person who created the show, who had spent years building toward this exact opportunity, was about to be replaced in his own creation over a vocal performance the network didn't buy. Roiland saved the role himself. Rather than accept the recast, he went back and reworked the character from the ground up, moving away from the whiny, theatrical read and towards something flatter, more grounded. A kid who sounds normal and pissed off rather than performing distress. That adjustment, small as it sounds described this way, is the actual reason Morty talks the way he does across the whole run of the show, stammering but with an edge underneath it. Someone who complains constantly, but who can also, when it matters, push back. Roiland has said the goal was giving Morty some spine, something that could fight back rather than just react. It is worth sitting with how close that came to not happening. A version of this show exists, in theory, where Justin Roiland never voices Morty at all, where some other actor's Red becomes the character's default, and Rick and Morty, as we know it, defined so heavily by the chemistry between its two original vocal performances, simply doesn't exist in that form. The pilot's opening also went through a much bigger swap than most viewers realize, which brings us back to that unaired cold open. In the cut that never aired, Rick is calmly testing his portal gun, while Morty absent-mindedly pushes two random items together in the garage. And out pops a small dinosaur that bolts off before anyone can really process what happened, with the portal gun only starting to beep and threaten to self-destruct once the chaos is already underway. It's a funnier, weirder, more randomly generated version of the exact kind of gag the show would spend the next several seasons perfecting. Physical comedy chaos stacked on top of a half-explained science premise. It got replaced before the version you know ever reached broadcast, and there's no single confirmed public reason on record for the swap, just the fact that it happened, which is itself the kind of detail that tends to disappear from a show's official history the moment a cleaner, tighter cut exists to replace it. The pilot's original subplot for Jerry and Beth didn't survive either, and this is one of the more interesting near misses in the show's development, because both discarded ideas tell you something about what Rick and Morty eventually decided not to be. That idea actually surfaced later, while the writers were breaking the story for the show's second season opener, and it had Jerry and Beth stuck among a crowd of strangers on an island or a parking garage. Dan Harmon's own homage to the kind of high-concept mystery television that Lost had made a cultural fixture a few years earlier. Another version of that same Season 2 idea had them caught in a time loop, unknowingly reliving the same moments as the timeline fractured around them, mirroring Rick's own science fiction machinations elsewhere in that episode. Both were scrapped in favor of the much smaller, much more mundane story that actually aired in that Season 2 premiere, Jerry and Beth hitting a deer with the car, and Beth fighting to save its life, an operation she ultimately pulls off. That's it. No island, no loop, just two exhausted parents dealing with a dying animal while their world quietly turns into science fiction around them. The show, even at the pilot stage, seems to have understood something about itself. The family drama works better small and domestic, banked against the enormous, absurd stuff Rick brings into the house, rather than competing with it on the same scale. None of this development drama stayed contained before broadcast, either. The finished pilot leaked online days ahead of its scheduled air date, surfacing on YouTube around November 27th, several days before the official December 2nd premiere, and it reportedly made its way to Reddit's R-Videos community, picking up what by most accounts was a modest number of upvotes and comments in its first couple of months, a real but modest number by the standards of internet virality, the kind of early traction that looks unremarkable in the moment and only becomes meaningful in hindsight. When the episode aired as scheduled, it pulled in about 1.1 million viewers, a solid number for a new Adult Swim show, but nothing that would have predicted, on its own, the scale this franchise would eventually reach. The actual beginning was just ordinary, and that's worth noticing on its own. No viral explosion, no overnight phenomenon, just a leaked episode with a few thousand upvotes and a broadcast night that did fine. Everything the series became, it became slowly, built on top of a beginning that looked, at the time, like nothing special at all. Season 1 ran from December of 2013 through April of the following year, and by the time it wrapped, the writers had already learned something they hadn't planned for. By most accounts, it was Justin Roiland who who said the room genuinely hadn't anticipated Mr. Meeseeks becoming a fan favorite. The character existed, in the writer's original plan, as a brief cameo, a small idea deployed and then set aside. Had they known ahead of time how much the audience would latch onto him, Harmon said, they would have built a full episode specifically around him rather than the short appearance they'd already scheduled. That's a strange thing for a writing staff to admit in public, that a character, now treated as one of its most iconic creations, printed on merchandise, quoted constantly, was never meant to carry that kind of weight in the first place. It's a small reminder that a show's own writers don't always know, in the moment, which of their ideas is about to become load-bearing for the whole franchise's identity. That gap between plan and outcome only widened going into season 2, and one particular episode nearly broke the writer's room trying to close it. A Rickle in Time, the season's premiere, is built around Frozen Time, a cold open where Rick, Morty, and Summer are stuck in a sibling squabble over which of them Rick likes more, with the moment itself paused so it can splinter into a triptych of possible outcomes before picking one and moving forward. Simple enough as a premise. In practice, according to accounts from the writers themselves, it turned into one of the most contentious pieces of writing the series had produced up to that point. Roiland wanted to dig seriously into the consequences of frozen time as a mechanic, treating it almost like a real physics problem the characters had to reason through. Other writers in the room wanted to keep the whole idea contained to the cold open and move on with a normal episode. Dan Harmon, characteristically, wanted to go even further than Roiland and structure the entire season around the frozen time conceit rather than just the premiere. Roiland later described the process bluntly. It was just brutal, and it broke us to a certain extent. Harmon's own assessment was similarly unsparing, saying the concept went off the deep end and got really overcomplicated, and that the two of them remained pretty convinced the episode might be the worst one the show ever produced, specifically because of how tangled the writing became. The technical side of the episode fought back just as hard as the writer's room did. Director Wes Archer's animation software reportedly crashed repeatedly while trying to render the split-screen time riff sequences the script demanded, a detail that turns A Rickle in Time from just a contested piece of writing into something closer to a genuine production ordeal. Ideas, the tools of the time, weren't fully built to execute. It's worth pairing this with the Mr. Meeseeks story from a season earlier, because together they say something honest about how this show actually gets made. It isn't a smooth pipeline running from a fully formed idea straight through to a polished final product. It's writers disagreeing hard enough to call an episode brutal, directors fighting software that keeps crashing, and a fan-favorite character existing almost by accident because nobody predicted how the audience would respond. None of that is visible watching the finished Season 2 premiere. What you see is a competent, if divisive, time loop episode. What actually happened behind it was closer to a small crisis. An early draft of that same episode also shows the fingerprints of the very lost parody idea the writers had already thrown out once during the pilot. The B story, originally being considered for Beth and Jerry in A Rickle in Time, had them stranded on a mysterious island, another riff on the mystery television format the writers had rejected for the pilot's own B-plot. Iso tam no sobreviviu, trocado pela istria que de facto foi para o ar, em que o casal atropela viado como caro e Beth luta para salvar o animal depois de gado reclamar a posse dele. According to reporting on the episode's development, the writers felt that Lost-style mystery shows tend to fizzle out unsatisfyingly by the time they resolve, and that the structure wouldn't land as comedy the way a tighter, stranger conceit could. Foi uma nica sala de escritores, numa nica ocasio, como idea de deixar Jerry e Beth largados, numa ilha misteriosa, a competir, com outra ideia de os prender num ciclo temporal. E a Sri recusu, as duas em favor da istria do veado que acabou por ir para o ar. That's not a coincidence. That's a writer's room actively steering away from a genre it didn't trust itself to satirize well, which tells you something about how deliberately this show curates its own influences even when it's borrowing from something as culturally massive as Lost. Season 2 closed out on October 4th, 2015, and what followed was the longest stretch of silence the series would ever put its audience through, roughly 18 months with no new episodes, stretching all the way to April of 2017. For a show that had built real momentum through its first 2 seasons, that's an enormous gap. Long enough that a normal marketing calendar would have demanded some kind of build-up, a trailer campaign, a premiere date announced weeks in advance, the standard machinery networks used to make sure an audience doesn't wander off during a long hiatus. Adult Swim did the opposite. Season 3 arrived on April 1st, 2017, April Fool's Day, with no advance promotion at all, a genuine surprise drop treated internally as a prank on the audience as much as a premiere. The stunt worked spectacularly. The Rickshank Rickdemption pulled in 676,000 households on its very first airing that night. And because Adult Swim replayed the episode roughly every half hour from 8 in the evening until midnight Eastern, the ratings actually climbed with each successive airing rather than falling off the way a normal rerun schedule would predict, as word spread in real time that the surprise was real and people scrambled to catch it. Coverage at the time credited this stunt with helping push the show to what's been called critical mass in terms of cultural relevance, arguing it wasn't just a clever marketing trick, but an actual turning point in how broadly it registered outside its existing fan base. That's an interpretation worth flagging as exactly that, an interpretation. But it lines up with what happened next. Season 3's first 3 episodes each beat every previous season's rating in the key adults 18 to 49 demographic. And by the time Pickle Rick aired in early August, the show was pulling in 2.3 million viewers on premiere night, with the season's overall viewership up 81% over Season 2. Enough to make Rick and Morty the #1 comedy on television among both the 18 to 24 and 18 to 34 demographics per Nielsen. The season finale broke records outright. The Rick and Morty date, which aired October 1st, 2017, reportedly pulled some of the strongest same-day ratings it had seen among younger adult viewers, according to figures that circulated at the time. By most accounts, that made it one of the most watched telecasts of the day across basic cable in those demographics, and reportedly among the highest-rated telecasts in Adult Swim's network history up to that point. Consider the arc here: 18 months of total silence, an unannounced surprise premiere as the reintroduction, and by the season's final episode, a genuine cable-wide ratings record. That's not a show clawing its way back into relevance after a long absence. That's a show using the absence itself as part of the pitch, letting anticipation build in a vacuum and then cashing it in all at once. None of that context excuses how short the season actually turned out to be, and it's worth being honest about the gap between what was promised and what aired. Season 3 was originally planned and announced at 14 episodes, and it ultimately shipped only 10. Dan Harmon told Entertainment Weekly he took the blame for the shortfall personally, pointing to his own perfectionism and its production pacing as the reason, saying at the time that he was still learning how to do the show efficiently. The back half of the season didn't resume its weekly airings until the following July, months after the April premiere, which means the record-breaking momentum from that unannounced drop had to survive an internal production gap of its own even while the season was technically airing. It is a strange kind of success story, a show simultaneously setting ratings records and admitting, through its own co-creator, that it couldn't hit its original episode count. Season 3 is also where Rick and Morty accidentally created a genuine piece of fast food history, and it's worth telling this one carefully because the timeline gets exaggerated in retellings. In the Rickshank Rickdemption, Rick's entire arc is driven by an obsession with recovering a specific dipping sauce, Szechuan sauce, which is not an invented prop. McDonald's really did release a Szechuan teriyaki dipping sauce back in 1998 as a promotional tie-in for the animated film Mulan, and it had been discontinued and mostly forgotten for nearly 2 decades before the episode brought it roaring back into cultural memory. A large number of fans signed petitions asking McDonald's to bring it back, and the company actually did. First in a limited October 2017 release, and then in a proper nationwide rollout in February of 2018. The October run was a genuine embarrassment for the company. Participating stores reportedly received only somewhere between 20 and 40 packets each nationwide, which predictably caused frustrated crowds and real anger at stores that had advertised the sauce's return without the supply to back it up. McDonald's response was to massively overcorrect, reportedly shipping a huge nationwide supply of packets for the February redo. A single joke, essentially, an animated character's fixation on a discontinued dipping sauce, ended up reshaping actual McDonald's supply chain decisions a few months later. Very few pieces of television trivia can claim that kind of direct, measurable effect on a real company's inventory planning. Now to the part of this video that gets closest to what the title actually promises, because there is a real, confirmed lost episode of Rick and Morty, and both of the people best positioned to describe it have refused to do so for years. In July of 2019, Dan Harmon and Justin Roiland told Entertainment Weekly, on the record, that an episode of the show had been abandoned partway through production. Not rewritten, not delayed, abandoned outright, because fixing whatever had gone wrong with it would have taken as long as simply building an entirely new episode from scratch. That's a specific and telling detail. This wasn't a script that never got greenlit or a pitch that died in the writer's room. This was an episode far enough into actual production, presumably with boards, maybe voice work, maybe partial animation, that the decision to kill it was a production decision made after real resources had already gone into it. What makes this unusual, rather than just another footnote about a canceled episode, is what the two creators refused to give up. Harmon said, in that same interview, that the episode's logline was as simple as its title, which is either an intriguing hint or a total non-answer, depending on how you read it, since it tells you nothing about the plot, while implying the concept itself was compact enough to summarize in a few words. He also said he thought fans would probably enjoy watching the rough, unfinished animatic, even though he didn't believe it would have worked as a finished, polished, aired episode. A distinction worth sitting with, because it suggests the problem wasn't the idea itself so much as the execution never coming together in time. According to later reporting on that same interview, Harmon even floated wanting to screen the unfinished animatic at Comic-Con, and Roiland joked about the idea of crowdfunding some way for fans to finish the episode themselves. Neither of those things happened. Neither creator has, at any point since that 2019 interview, revealed the episode's title or plot. It's worth being precise about what we can and can't say here, because this is exactly the kind of story that tends to grow speculative details the longer it circulates without an official answer. What we know, an episode existed in some unfinished form, was abandoned because repairing it wasn't worth the production time. And both creators have gone on record confirming this happened, while declining every opportunity since to say more. What we don't know, and what nobody should pretend to know, what the episode was about, which season it would have belonged to, how far into production it got, or whether any footage from it still exists anywhere. Fans have speculated for years about what it might have been, floating theories tied to abandoned concepts mentioned elsewhere, but none of that speculation traces back to anything either creator has confirmed. If you see a video or a forum post claiming to know the plot of the lost 2019 episode, that claim is not coming from Harmon or Roiland. It's coming from someone filling in a blank its own creators have deliberately left empty. There's something worth noting about the restraint on display here too, because this is a franchise that rarely resists explaining itself. Rick and Morty is a show that has spent multiple episodes explicitly walking audiences through its own multiverse mechanics. That gave an entire finale over to explaining why Rick has spent seasons being called the smartest man in the universe. That eventually built a whole episode around unpacking Rick and Rick Prime's shared backstory. Restraint isn't really this show's house style, and yet here is a genuinely real, on-the-record confirmed piece of its own production history, and its creators have simply chosen, consistently, across years of press opportunities where the question would have been an easy, fan-pleasing answer to give, not to give it. Whatever that episode was, it stayed a locked drawer in a franchise that otherwise likes showing you everything inside every drawer it has. If the 2019 episode is the franchise's most guarded secret, Pickle Rick might be its most instructive success story of all, because the gap between how casually it started and how tightly it ended up plotted is enormous. Per the Season 3 Blu-ray commentary, as reported by Newsweek, the entire premise began as a throwaway joke Dan Harmon improvised right before the writer's room broke for Thanksgiving. There was no elaborate pitch document, no months of development, just a joke tossed out before everyone left for the holiday. Harmon and writer Jessica Gao then sat down and rewrote the concept overnight, reworking an earlier, scrapped premise about a rat-infested restaurant and black ops exterminators into what eventually became the finished episode. Harmon reportedly fell asleep mid-typing during that overnight session. He has since compared the episode's unusually tight plotting to Breaking Bad's 4 Days Out, a compliment that lands differently once you know it came together in something close to a single sleepless night rather than through a normal writer's room process. The commentary track, recorded by director Anthony Chun, adds a layer of specificity that rewards paying close attention on a rewatch. Chun said the episode's visual gags were shot referenced against Ratatouille and The Castle of Cagliostro, two films that don't share an obvious surface style with each other, let alone with an animated adult sitcom about a scientist turning himself into a pickle to avoid family therapy. The sewer rat fight sequence, meanwhile, was modeled specifically on the hallway fight from Oldboy, one of the most famous single-take brawl sequences in modern action cinema, repurposed here for a pickle-shaped grandfather clawing his way through vermin with scavenged body parts. On the vocal side, Susan Sarandon, who voices Dr. Wong in the episode's closing scene, recorded her entire monologue over the phone and did it in just 3 takes. And Harmon confirmed something about the episode's writing that's easy to miss without the commentary pointing it out directly. He deliberately cut every direct reference to drinking from the script, so that the alcoholism metaphor running underneath Rick's whole arc in this episode stays entirely subtextual. That makes Pickle Rick the only episode in its entire run where drinking is never explicitly mentioned on screen, despite being, by Harmon's own account, an episode fundamentally about addiction. The design process behind Pickle Rick himself went through several stages that never made it past the concept phase, and character designer Maximus Pausen has talked about this directly in interviews. Before landing on the design that survived to broadcast, the team seriously considered a version with rat-like haunches grafted onto the pickle body, a hybrid modeled loosely on the armored Big Daddy enemies from the BioShock video games, and a rat centaur concept built around claw machine-style mechanical limbs. All 3 were thrown out. Posun has said the goal that finally won out was a design that emphasized the pickleness of the character rather than burying it under monster movie iconography, which sounds like an obvious call in retrospect, but clearly wasn't obvious in the room, given how far the concept art wandered before settling. The rats Pickle Rick fights through in the sewer got a comparable amount of deliberate design attention working in the opposite direction. The design team reportedly gave them arched backs, visible boils, and thinned out fur, seemingly meant to keep the audience from feeling much sympathy for them once Pickle Rick starts killing them for spare mechanical parts. That's a level of intentional cruelty in a background creature design that most viewers would never consciously register, and it's exactly the kind of detail a wiki cross-reference or a stray interview quote is built to surface, because nothing about watching the finished scene tips you off that the rats were engineered. on a design level, to be unlikable enough that their deaths wouldn't cost the episode any emotional weight. Put these pieces together, and Pickle Rick stops looking like the tightly engineered, singularly focused episode fans tend to describe it as, and starts looking more like a controlled collision of borrowed references, overnight rewrites, and design trial and error that happened to land clean. Ratatouille and Oldboy sitting in the same reference pile. A joke born the day before a holiday break turned into one of its most awarded episodes, the one that won the show its first Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program. A design process that tried a claw machine rat centaur before arriving at something as simple as a pickle with mechanical legs. None of that messiness survives into the final cut, which is arguably the whole point of a commentary track existing in the first place, to show you the seams a finished episode is specifically built to hide. Go back one season and you find another episode whose real inspiration has almost nothing to do with what its title implies. Total Rickle, the memory parasite episode from season 2, has a title built on an obvious pun on Total Recall, and most casual conversation about the episode assumes that's where the idea came from. It isn't. According to writer Mike McMahon, who pitched the episode's core concept, the actual inspiration was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Specifically, that show's 5th season retroactively introducing Dawn as Buffy's previously unmentioned younger sister, a character the entire cast simply accepts as having always been there, memories and all, with zero in-story explanation offered at the time. McMahon took that structural trick, a fictional world quietly rewriting its own past and having every character treat the rewrite as though it had always been true, and applied it to a house full of parasites that implant false memories of themselves into everyone around them, so convincingly that Beth, Jerry, Summer, and Morty all accept total strangers as beloved family friends. Reportedly, a staffer in the writer's room found the idea genuinely upsetting once it was actually applied to implanted memories rather than just discussed as an abstract structural device, which tracks. Because there's something uniquely disturbing about extending the audience accepts a retconned family member into your own brain, accepts a false memory of loving someone who was never there. The rest of Total Recall carries smaller reference layers stacked on top of that Buffy foundation. Rick's line, Rikki Tikki Tavi, is a direct play on Rikki Tikki Tavi, Rudyard Kipling's mongoose character from The Jungle Book, and the episode's parasite threat. Something that looks and sounds exactly like someone you trust doubles as a nod to John Carpenter's The Thing, the 1982 body horror film built around exactly that same kind of infiltration paranoia. None of that changes what the episode is actually about underneath the jokes, which is a fairly bleak point about how fragile trust and memory both are inside a family that's already under strain. But it's worth knowing that the joke title sent people looking in entirely the wrong direction for years. Season 3's Blu-ray commentary opened up a few more of these gaps between what aired and what was originally planned. The Rickshank Rickdemption, the season's premiere, was reportedly conceived at one point as a 2-part episode meant to close out Season 2 rather than open Season 3, which would have meant introducing the Szechuan sauce plotline a full season earlier than it actually reached the screen. That's a meaningfully different show, one where Rick's imprisonment and escape resolve within Season 2's runtime instead of anchoring the long silence before Season 3. The same commentary track revealed that Vindicators 3, the team-up episode featuring the Vindicators superhero group, originally had a larger roster of heroes along with a cut Morty-centered sidekick subplot that didn't survive to the final version, and that as of the commentary's recording, the writers still hadn't settled internally on whether the Beth raising the family is the clone or the original, a question the show has left famously deliberately open since the reveal in the ABCs of Beth. That same episode, the ABCs of Beth, turns out to have had one of the more turbulent editing histories of the whole season on a structural level. Its Fruppyland sequence, the flashback showing young Beth and Rick building and populating an entire pocket dimension world of alien children, was reportedly relocated during post-production more than once, moved out of the main narrative and into the episode's closing tag, then pulled back into the main narrative a second time before the final cut locked. Commentary on the season singles this scene out as the single most reworked sequence of the whole run of episodes that year, which is a striking thing to learn about a scene that plays in the finished episode as one continuous, uninterrupted emotional beat. You'd never guess from watching it that the editors moved it around the episode structure twice before deciding where it actually belonged. The Vindicators, as a concept, went through even more churn before the roster the series eventually used got locked in. According to trivia compiled from its own writer's room history, several team members were scrapped before the final lineup was set, including a stretchy powered character called Dr. Reach, a pair of Siamese twin heroes, one written as conventionally attractive and one deliberately not, and a superpowered knitting grandmother. None of those made the cut. What did make it to screen, the roster fans actually know from Vindicators 2 and Vindicators 3, is the tamer, more streamlined version of a much stranger initial pitch, and it's worth remembering that anytime a background superhero team on this show looks slightly generic, there was very likely a weirder, more specific version sitting in an earlier draft that got cut for being too much. Even for this show's tolerance for absurdity, no corner of this show's development generated more rejected material than Morty's Mind Blowers, and the scale of what got thrown away there is worth putting a real number on. Writers Dan Gutterman, James Siciliano, and Mike McMahon reportedly pitched somewhere around 100 individual mind-blower concepts for that episode. Small standalone memory vignettes meant to be extracted from Morty's brain and viewed out of context. The room voted to narrow that pile down, then, apparently unsatisfied, wrote even more on top of what survived the first cut. Guterman has named some of what didn't make it in interviews since: a memory of an elderly Morty helping his granddaughter with her homework, a vignette involving Rick falling in love with a fire truck, and a fake premium cable-style opening title sequence that Rick supposedly produced for a hypothetical future Mind Blowers episode that was never actually made. Gutterman has also said, candidly, that most of his own pitches for the episode were simply too weird to make the final cut, which is a genuinely funny thing to hear from a writer on a show this comfortable with weirdness as its default register. Among the specific rejected ideas, a segment where Morty gets turned into a living painting and then auctioned off, voted down along with the rest of the surplus material once the room had more vignettes than the episode could hold. Season 4 carried some of this same appetite for unused ideas straight into its own Blu-ray commentary. A segment called Nibulongs was cut from the Mind Blowers concept going into that season, and Roiland reportedly hoped to find a way to reuse the idea later, though there's no confirmation that ever happened. Roiland also pushed, without success at the time, for Dr. Wong's return to a future episode, for more stories set specifically in a high school environment, and for the series to dig deeper into the science, such as it is, behind Phoenix Person and Tammy's transformation. None of those pushes turned into produced episodes in the time frame the commentary covers, which tells you that even a co-creator with Roiland's level of creative authority doesn't get every pitch through the room. A small but real check on the idea that the person whose name is on the marquee gets whatever he wants written. One of the season's other episodes has a surprising origin that has nothing to do with Rick and Morty at all. The Old Man in the Seat, which turns Rick's private planet bathroom into the site of a full-blown turf war, began as a concept Dan Harmon developed years earlier for an entirely different show. According to Harmon's own account, the shy pooper idea, a character psychologically unable to use public restrooms, was originally written for Jeff Winger on Community and shelved there, never making it to air. Years later, with an entire studio audience presumably having no idea the joke had a prior life, Harmon repurposed the shelved Community concept into Rick's bathroom territory episode on Rick and Morty. That's a strange kind of creative recycling. A comedic premise mothballed on one show for years before finding its actual home on a completely different one, and it's the kind of connection that would be essentially impossible to notice without Harmon volunteering it directly, since nothing about the finished Rick and Morty episode gestures back toward community in any way a viewer could catch on. Their own? Season 3's Rest and Reclaxation carries its own small deleted detail worth knowing, tucked into a premise built loosely off a Star Trek teleporter malfunction setup. Some accounts of the season's production suggest an early version of the episode's core device came with a limitation preventing its use on adolescents, though the exact wording of that supposed rule is difficult to confirm, and it never made it into the aired episode. It's a small thing, a single unused rule about teenage brain chemistry that never made it past the writer's room. But it's exactly the kind of granular deleted detail that separates watching an episode from actually knowing its production history. Concept art from around this same stretch of the series adds 2 more names worth knowing if you've ever wondered how much material gets generated and discarded before a single background character locks into its final design. Concept art said to survive from the making of Morty Night Run reportedly includes an unused character designed for the wet, steamy alien garage setting where Rick buys the antimatter gun from Crombopulous Michael, though the artist and the character's exact identity are hard to confirm. And on Look Who's Purging Now, it said the alien character Arthresia did not have a locked design when boarding began, so whoever was storyboarding apparently drew the character however felt right for the boards. Roiland apparently liked her interpretation enough that it became the character's actual final on-screen design, meaning one of its alien characters exists in its official form, specifically because a storyboard artist's rough guess got approved rather than replaced by a formal model sheet. That's a genuinely unusual path for a character design to take on a show with a full art department, closer to how a scrappy student film might handle character design than how a network animated series usually operates. Up to this point, everything in this video has been about material that existed at some stage and then got cut before it reached you. This next stretch is different because it's about episodes that did air that you have almost certainly seen, existing in more than one version depending entirely on when and where you watch them. Forgetting Sarek Morchel from Season 5 is the clearest example. Its cold open originally featured Morty crossing an item off a to-do list, a joke referring to fictional cookie terrorists as Cookie ISIS. That's how the joke aired in its original broadcast window in September of 2021. On reruns, and on most subsequent digital and streaming prints, that line and its accompanying graphic were changed to Cookie Freedom instead, a swap made because of real-world sensitivities tied to events happening around that same broadcast period. The show never announced this change. There was no press release explaining it. It just happened, quietly, somewhere between the original airing and whatever version streams today. Watch the episode now, and you'll see Cookie Freedom. Find a recording of the original September broadcast, and you'll see something else. Both are real, aired versions of the same episode, existing simultaneously, which is a stranger situation than most viewers realize when they rewatch a Season 5 episode without knowing to look for it. The strangest single broadcast event in this entire video, though, might be what Adult Swim did on April 1st, 2021. For that year's April Fool's Day, the network rebranded its entire nighttime programming block as Adult Swim Junior. And it wasn't a fake trailer or a one-off bumper joke. It was a full, professionally produced redub of an actual episode. Total Rickle was retitled Rick and Morty Babies and aired with genuine baby-style vocal performances, replacing the original cast. Mr. Poopy Butthole renamed to Mr. Poopy Butt Butt, and every instance of profanity swapped for sanitized substitutes, the most memorable being Mother Scrubber, standing in for the word you'd expect. Other Adult Swim shows got the same treatment that same night, including Venture Cousins, Harvey Birdman, Junior Associate, and Super Juvie. Versions of Adult Swim's actual programming redressed as saccharine children's television for one broadcast night only. This isn't rumor or fan edit territory. It was a real, aired broadcast produced by the network itself, existing as an actual alternate version of one of its most acclaimed episodes. And if you weren't watching Adult Swim that specific night, there's a real chance you've never heard it happened at all. Streaming has quietly created its own layer of version differences on top of the broadcast ones. HBO Max's version of the series censors nudity outright, with no uncensored option available on that platform, the way there is on physical Blu-ray and DVD releases. And for seasons 1 through 5, it also censored strong language, bleeping profanity the same way the original cable broadcasts did. Starting with season 6, that platform's episodes stream uncensored for language per side-by-side comparisons fans have documented, meaning the exact same show carries two different censorship standards depending on which season you're watching on the same platform without any on-screen indication of the switch. There's a narrower, more specific layer of censorship sitting on top of even that later, uncensored period too, even after HBO Max stopped bleeping general profanity from season 6 onward. It apparently still specifically mutes strong or vulgar language whenever that language is directed at the Chinese government, a content-targeted edit distinct from the blanket profanity censorship of the earlier seasons, and one that has outlasted it. The most politically loaded example of this whole pattern involves an episode you'd have no reason to suspect of hiding anything at all on a first watch. Final Dismissation is said to contain 3 coded strings of letters and numbers appearing somewhere in the episode, cited by fans as roughly GFHG19SDGM, 721DELLM, and 19HK831, though the exact air date and the precise codes are difficult to confirm independently. Fans in Hong Kong decoded these almost immediately after broadcast. Read a certain way, they function as shorthand for the banned protest chant, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times," a slogan that Hong Kong authorities had explicitly outlawed following the territory's 2019 pro-democracy protests. The other 2 strings appear to reference specific dates from those same protests: the July 21st mob attack on protesters at a train station, and the August 31st police beatings at Prince Edward Station, 2 of the most widely remembered and most contested incidents of that entire movement. According to reporting from Hong Kong Free Press at the time, fans who decoded the codes openly worried the episode itself might get pulled from circulation in the territory, given how aggressively Hong Kong's post-2019 media environment had cracked down on exactly this kind of content. It's worth being careful about how to frame that last one, because it sits right at the edge of what can be stated as fact versus what has to stay flagged as fan interpretation. What's confirmed, those specific character strings do appear in the episode, and Hong Kong fans decoded them into that specific reading almost immediately after broadcast. A decoding reported on by an actual news outlet rather than just circulating as forum speculation. What isn't confirmed, at least not in anything available to this video's research, is any official statement from Rick and Morty's writers or Adult Swim acknowledging the codes were intentional or explaining who put them there or why. The reading is compelling, and it was compelling enough to worry the fans who found it, but it remains a piece of decoded content rather than a confirmed creative statement, and that distinction matters even when the pattern match is this precise. Every production history this video has told so far has been about creative material, jokes, scenes, episodes. This next part of the story is different because it's about the show almost losing one of its 2 creators entirely, and it's worth walking through the actual sequence of events carefully, because the order things happened in matters more than the headlines from that period usually convey. In 2020, Justin Roiland was arrested on suspicion of felony domestic violence, stemming from an incident involving a woman he was dating at the time. That arrest was not publicly known for years. It only became public knowledge in January of 2023 when NBC News reported on it. Adult Swim, which by then was under Warner Bros. Discovery, and Hulu, which had its own Roiland-adjacent projects, both cut ties with him that same month. within days of the report going public. Here's the part of the timeline that gets flattened or misremembered most often. The domestic violence charges against Roiland were dismissed by the Orange County District Attorney's Office in March of 2023, roughly 2 months after the networks had already dropped him, reportedly citing insufficient evidence to proceed. That means Adult Swim's decision to sever ties and the recasting process that followed from it happened before any legal resolution, not after a conviction, and not in response to the charges being dropped either. It's an important distinction to get right. Roiland was not convicted of anything, and the show did not recast him because a court found him guilty of something. It recast him because the network made a business and public relations decision the moment the allegation became public, and that decision didn't reverse itself once the case against him fell apart 2 months later. Both of those facts are true, and neither one cancels the other out. The charges were dropped, and the series moved on without him anyway. The practical result of all this was that Rick and Morty had to solve a problem no long-running animated show wants to face, replacing the single vocal performer behind both of its title characters mid-run, with no advance plan for how to do it. Season 7, which premiered October 15th, 2023, introduced Ian Cardoni as the new voice of Rick and Harry Belden as the new voice of Morty. By some accounts, the casting search took several months and involved a large number of submissions before the production settled on these two actors. Adult Swim kept their identities out of the pre-season marketing entirely, holding the reveal until the actual Season 7 premiere aired, rather than announcing the new cast in a trailer the way most productions would, which meant audiences tuning in that October night were hearing the new performances for the first time, with zero advance preparation for how different or similar they'd sound. Season 7 marks the first time in the show's history that it was produced without Roiland involved in any creative capacity, not as a voice actor, not as a credited creative force behind the scenes. That's a genuine dividing line in its production history, arguably the clearest one this entire video has covered. A season number after which one of the two names most associated with creating the whole franchise simply isn't part of making it anymore. Scott Martyr, who has served as showrunner since Season 5, and Dan Harmon, who remains co-showrunner and executive producer, carried it through that transition, and by most measures Rick and Morty didn't lose momentum doing it. Season 8 premiered in May of 2025. Season 9 followed in May of 2026, both 10-episode seasons running on a tighter, more predictable annual schedule than it ever managed during its earlier, more chaotic gap years. Whatever else changed, the actual release cadence got more reliable in the years immediately following the departure of one of its two creators, not less, which is worth noting without drawing too firm a conclusion from it about why. Every long-running show accumulates contradictions, but Rick and Morty has done something a little different with several of its biggest ones. It has gone back and actively rewritten what they mean, turning old plot points into the foundation for new ones, rather than just hoping nobody notices the seams. The Citadel of Ricks is the clearest example. For a long stretch of the show's run, fans understood the Citadel simply as the Ricks government, a big, bureaucratic space station where infinite versions of Rick coexist under some kind of shared authority, background world building rather than a story with its own history. That framing turned out to be incomplete. According to later material and statements from the production, Rick C-137, this version of Rick, effectively triggered the Citadel's formation himself by killing large numbers of other Ricks across the multiverse while he was hunting Rick Prime, the Rick responsible for murdering his wife and daughter back on his original Earth. The Citadel wasn't erected to police him from the outside. It was built, essentially, as a peace treaty, one that C-137 himself helped negotiate and design once his killing spree had run its course. Showrunner Scott Martyr has gone as far as calling Rick the Citadel's founding father, language that reframes an institution fans had spent years reading as a check on Rick's power into something closer to his own creation. Bird Person's death and return is a different kind of retcon, less a reinterpretation of old information and more a tangled, multi-stage chain of plot developments that resist being summarized as a single clean resurrection. He's killed in the Season 2 finale, The Wedding Squanchers, shot by Tammy, who is revealed in that same episode to be an undercover Galactic Federation agent rather than the person Bird Person thought he was marrying. That would be a complete, permanent death in most shows. Here, the Season 3 premiere's post-credits scene reveals Tammy and her Federation allies actually rebuilt him as a cyborg called Phoenix Person, alive again, but fundamentally altered. He's then dismantled and altered further across Season 4, including a confrontation with Rick in that season's finale, and only later in its run does he get restored to something closer to his original form. 4 separate stages, spread across multiple seasons, each one changing what Bird Person is dead or Bird Person is alive actually means at that point in the story. Compressing that into he died and then came back erases most of what actually makes the arc interesting, which is how unstable and repeatedly renegotiated his condition is across the show's timeline. The central finite curve retcon works differently again, because it doesn't just add new information, it actively reframes years of prior seasons' framing all at once. Season 5's 2-part finale introduced the concept, a walled-off pocket of the broader multiverse, deliberately and artificially constructed, specifically engineered so that this show's Rick would always register as the smartest version within it. That single reveal recontextualizes every earlier season's repeated claim that Rick is the smartest man in the universe, turning what audiences had been taking at face value as an absolute unqualified fact into what was really just a rigged local condition, true only because someone built the walls that way on purpose. It's an elegant piece of retroactive plotting, the kind of reveal that makes you want to go back and rewatch earlier seasons with new context. But it's also worth being precise about what it does and doesn't establish. It doesn't make Rick less capable in absolute terms. It just clarifies that smartest man in the universe was never the universal claim its own earlier dialogue implied it was. One of Rick and Morty's quietest retcons sat completely unacknowledged for 4 full seasons before finally getting confirmed. In Morty Night Run, Rick loses his family's daycare ticket at the interdimensional Jerry Daycare Center and, at the end of the episode, grabs what looks like a random duplicate Jerry to bring home instead of dealing with the mess properly. The episode played this completely straight at the time. No wink to camera, no lingering shot suggesting anything was off. Just Rick grabbing a Jerry and moving on with the episode. It stayed that way, unacknowledged, until the Season 6 premiere, Solarix, when a mass portal traveler reset sends displaced interdimensional travelers back to their home dimensions, and Jerry gets swept up and returned to what's identified as his true original dimension, confirming, 4 seasons after the fact, that the family really had been living with a swapped duplicate Jerry the entire time without anyone in universe or in the audience realizing it. That's an unusually patient piece of continuity to plant and then simply let sit, unexplained, for that long, trusting that either nobody would notice or that the eventual payoff would land better for the wait. Spacebeth raises a different kind of unresolved question, one it has left open on purpose rather than by accident. Introduced in the Season 4 finale, Spacebeth exists alongside the Beth who stayed on Earth raising the family, and the series has never definitively settled which of the two is the clone created after the events of the ABCs of Beth and which is the original. This isn't a case of the writers forgetting to answer the question. Dan Harmon has spoken about the franchise's broader fascination with clone and identity ambiguity as a way of exploring nature versus nurture, treating the unresolved status as a feature of the show's thematic interests rather than a loose end waiting to be tied off. Fans have theorized in both directions for years. Some convinced the stay-at-home Beth is the copy, others certain it's Space Beth, and as of the Season 3 commentary discussed earlier in this video, Even the writers themselves apparently hadn't settled on an internal answer at that point. Whatever conclusion it eventually reaches, if it ever does, this one belongs firmly in the theory category for now, not the confirmed fact one. Not every loose thread on this show gets tied off, even years later, and Mr. Poopy Butthole's basic nature might be the single clearest example of a question the series introduced, appeared to answer, and then quietly reopened without admitting it had done so. Total Rickle sets him up as a plausible memory parasite alongside all the other implanted false memories running through the episode. One more character the audience is meant to suspect isn't real. Then the episode delivers what plays, in the moment, as a definitive answer. Beth shoots him, and unlike every other parasite in the house, he doesn't revert to his true monstrous form. He just stays hurt and human-shaped and very much real. That's the punchline. He's real. Full stop, case closed. Except Dan Harmon has since described him, in interviews given after that episode aired, as something closer to a fourth-dimensional phantom species that only manifests in pockets of temporal malfunction or misperception. Read that description back against the episode's own supposedly conclusive gunshot scene, and the contradiction is hard to miss. Because a being that only manifests during temporal malfunction or misperception sounds like exactly the kind of entity Total Rickle was built to rule out, not confirm. It has never gone back and reconciled the two versions on screen. Both exist. One in the aired episode, one in its creator's later commentary, and the character's actual nature remains, functionally, unresolved. Age is another place where the internal math simply stops adding up the longer you follow it across seasons, and it's worth walking through the actual numbers rather than just gesturing at the kids don't age, because the specifics are stranger than that vague version suggests. Season 1 states Morty's age directly, 14, in Anatomy Park, and states Summer's age as 17 in 60 Minutes. Those are clean, simple numbers for a show's first season. Years pass in story after that, across dozens of episodes, and plenty of in-universe time jumps. But the writers barely move either character's stated age forward to match. By the time the Rickshank Rickdemption rolls around in Season 3, the Galactic Federation actually assigns Morty and Summer ages of 47 and 35 respectively, via what the episode frames as a weird in-universe calendar conversion, a number that doesn't scale sensibly against either their original ages or the roughly consistent gap between them. By Season 4's Never Ricking Morty, Summer more or less names the problem herself in dialogue, telling Morty she's felt like she'd be 17 forever, for 16 years, a line that acknowledges the contradiction directly without actually resolving it in any mathematical sense. That's the series pointing at its own plot hole and shrugging rather than patching it. Rick's own age creates a similar kind of tension with Beth's stated age, and this one has an actual on-record explanation from the show's current showrunner rather than a lampshading joke. A Season 7 episode is generally understood by fans to place roughly 40 years since Diane's death, though the exact title is easy to misremember. If you work backward from Rick's other stated ages at the time Beth was young, roughly 27 when Beth was 10, Beth's current age should land somewhere around 50, not the mid-30s she's consistently drawn and written as throughout the show. Scott Marder has addressed this contradiction directly rather than letting fans stew on it unanswered, saying plainly that Rick and Morty intentionally avoids birthday episodes and keeps its entire cast suspended in what he's called a weird time hole, rather than committing the series to a fixed, trackable chronology that every future script would then have to respect. That's a deliberate creative choice being described honestly by the person currently running the series. Not a mistake the production is hoping nobody notices, even if the specific numbers, once you actually do the arithmetic, don't line up. One more contradiction is worth knowing specifically because its own creators have addressed it on the record and essentially admitted they don't have a clean answer. In The Last Temptation of Jerry, Season 3, Rick references two 1980s and 90s films Iceman and Encino Man, and Morty claims not to recognize either one. Moments later in that same episode, Morty independently identifies a location as looking like it's straight out of The Wicker Man, a film considerably older than either reference he just claimed ignorance of. Scott Marder has chalked this up to Morty absorbing pop culture references from Rick by a kind of osmosis rather than deliberate film literacy, while Dan Harmon, in a separate interview, admitted this particular inconsistency was probably just habitual and accidental writing rather than an intentional bit of characterization. An unusually candid admission from a show that, as this video has already covered more than once, tends to hold itself accountable for internal contradictions rather than letting them slide unremarked. Step back from individual episodes for a moment and look at Rick and Morty's actual commercial trajectory, because the numbers involved get large enough that they're worth hearing in sequence rather than scattered across a decade of separate headlines. May 10th, 2018, Adult Swim announces a 70-episode renewal, an order-size press coverage at the time, framed as essentially unprecedented for an adult animated cable series, guaranteeing years of additional seasons in a single stroke rather than the season-by-season renewals it had operated under up to that point. Coverage citing Adult Swim's own data has since described Rick and Morty as the #1 comedy across all of American cable in 3 separate calendar years, 2017, 2019, and 2021, and has put its cumulative global viewership across linear broadcast, digital platforms, and streaming combined north of 10 billion views. Then, in the fall of 2024, Adult Swim went even further at that year's New York Comic Con, announcing a renewal extending it all the way through a 12th season, on top of the earlier confirmation that its long-term deal already extended production through a 10th. Scott Marder reportedly joked, announcing the news, that it would run for 100 years, forever. Half a punchline and half a genuine statement of confidence in a franchise that was, by that point, comfortably a decade into a format nobody in 2013 would have predicted lasting this long. Streaming rights tell their own separate, more fragmented story. Rather than one platform holding exclusive access, Hulu and HBO Max, now rebranded simply as Max, share non-exclusive United States streaming rights under a deal tied back to that original 70-episode renewal, expected to run through season 10, while Hulu separately holds exclusive rights to offline downloads for its ad-free subscribers, a level of contractual specificity that most casual viewers never think about until they're trying to figure out which app actually has the episode they want to rewatch. And its international footprint keeps generating surprises even this far into its run, as its Netflix licensing window was set to expire in January of 2026. Rick and Morty actually climbed to become Netflix's 5th most-watched television show worldwide according to Flix Patrol tracking, landing in the top 10 in 44 separate countries and peaking at position 2 in Austria, Germany, Latvia, and Lithuania, a strange kind of send-off for a licensing deal. The show getting more popular on a platform right as it was about to lose access to it there. Individual episodes have set their own records worth knowing on their own terms. Pickle Rick and its season's broader ratings run have already come up earlier in this video. The season 3 finale broke Adult Swim's own network history, a fact covered in that earlier chapter on the return from its long hiatus. Beyond the ratings side, Guinness World Records, using audience demand data compiled by Parrot Analytics, named Rick and Morty the world's most in-demand sitcom in 2025, reporting its global audience demand at over 40, 3 times higher than the average television show. An almost absurdly large gap between this show and the rest of the field it's technically being measured against. Not every record this show holds is a positive one, and it's worth including the other side honestly, rather than only cataloging the wins. Rise of the Numbericons, the movie, a season 7 episode, holds its lowest ever rating on IMDb, 5.1 out of 10, and carries the additional distinction of being the only episode across the entire series to never show or even mention Rick Sanchez at all. A strange combination of facts for a show literally named after him. An episode existing inside his own franchise that seemingly forgot to include him, and then scored as the weakest received hour the show has ever produced. Awards recognition rounds out this side of the show's story. Rick and Morty has won multiple Emmy Awards for Outstanding Animated Program across its run, including for Pickle Rick out of Season 3, and later for the Vat of Acid episode out of Season 4, reported at the time as its second Emmy in that category. Two very different episodes. One a tightly plotted survival thriller about a man trapped in a pickle's body, the other a Groundhog Day-style loop story about consequence avoidance, both recognized by the same award in the same category a season apart, which says something about how wide its register actually is, even when it's being honored for the same achievement twice. Everything covered so far has come from interviews, commentary tracks, and confirmed production history, things the show's own creators and crew have talked about on the record. This next stretch is different in kind, because it's built from the sort of detail that no interview reveals, the kind a viewer only catches by rewatching frame by frame or cross-referencing a wiki that some dedicated fan has spent years building out one episode at a time. Take the clock visible in Rick's garage. Across nearly the entire run of the series, whenever that clock appears in frame, it reads 2 o'clock. Not sometimes, not usually, nearly every single time, across dozens of episodes and hundreds of individual shots. The one confirmed exception tracked by the franchise's own wiki is a scene in Anatomy Park, Season 1, where the clock instead reads 3 o'clock. Somebody built an entire dedicated wiki page just to catalog this. A page whose entire purpose is tracking one background prop's clock hands across a whole production history. And that kind of obsessive documentation is exactly the layer this chapter lives in. Background photographs carry their own quiet clues if you know where to look. In the Season 3 premiere, the Rickshank Rickdemption, a framed photo of Doofus Rick is visible tucked away in a garage cupboard, easy to miss entirely at normal viewing speed. Doofus Rick is the friendly, dim-witted alternate Rick, introduced back in Season 1's Close Rick, Counters of the Rick kind. The one Rick who ever actually treated Jerry with something like kindness rather than contempt. Jerry inherited the garage while this Rick was imprisoned earlier that same season, and the photo reads, once you notice it, as a small, wordless implication that Jerry kept a memento of the one version of Rick who was ever decent to him, tucked away where nobody would think to look. Nothing in the dialogue points you toward this. It's purely a background prop, doing narrative work on its own, the kind of detail that rewards exactly the sort of repeat, close viewing this channel's audience tends to specialize in. A Season 1 throwaway line gets an elaborate payoff 2 seasons later. In Rick's Minutes, Morty delivers his now famous nihilistic monologue about how nobody exists on purpose, nobody belongs anywhere, everybody's going to die. It's meant, in that scene, as a bleak, cutting piece of dialogue landing in the middle of an otherwise comedic interdimensional cable episode. 2 seasons later, in the Ricklantis mix-up, a background election protest sign inside the citadel of Rick's reads, in full, nobody exists on purpose, repurposing Morty's own private breakdown as literal campaign messaging for his Citadel counterpart's presidential run. That's the series taking one of its bleakest character moments and recycling it as satire 2 seasons later, folding a piece of genuine despair into a joke about electoral sloganeering, which tells you something about how this show treats its own emotional beats as material to be reused and recontextualized rather than sealed off as sacred once they've aired. The Season 4 finale, Never Ricking Morty, builds an entire sequence around a literal story train, a meta device that turns its own narrative structure into a physical setting the characters walk through. Background photographs inside that train car frame 3 separate musical performances it had staged across its earlier seasons, specifically Goodbye Moonmen from Morty Night Run, Get Swifty, and the Tiny Rick song from Big Trouble in Little Sanchez, all from Season 2, turning the train car itself into a kind of in-universe clip show, built entirely out of production design set dressing rather than actual flashback footage. It's an unusually dense piece of self-referential world building, embedding its own musical history into the literal architecture of an episode that's already about narrative structure as a concept. The show's crossover moment with The Simpsons carries its own layer of buried references worth knowing. Back in May of 2015, Rick and Morty crashed into and killed off the Simpsons family in a couch gag the two shows collaborated on for that week's Simpsons episode, Mathlete's Feet, a chaotic 60-odd seconds of one show's characters violently intruding on another's. Buried in the background chaos of that same couch gag are several Futurama references another animated franchise, Rick and Morty, regularly gets compared to, including the Planet Express ship flying past in the background, an alien drinking Slurm at a vending machine, and a human character with a Futurama-style brain slug attached. A small cluster of homages layered into a segment that was already, on its surface, a crossover event between two completely different shows. Rick and Morty also recycles its own background performers more than casual viewing would ever suggest. Fans have nicknamed one recurring background alien Alien Octopus Woman, a character design that turns up across multiple, otherwise unconnected episodes. Analyze Piss, The Jarek Trap, and a brief cameo in Air Force Wong, the kind of reused crowd model that only stands out once someone cross-references screenshots across separate seasons. A different background alien, wearing a yellow top with a football and Roman numerals graphic and rainbow suspenders, is a fairly direct visual reference to Robin Williams' alien character from Mork and Mindy, and he shows up across 4 separate early season episodes: Lawn Mower Dog, the Rick Counters episode, Rixty Minutes, and Rixie Business, making him one of its most reused unnamed extras despite never getting a line of dialogue or a name of his own. One last Easter egg worth knowing connects Rick and Morty directly back to Dan Harmon's other show. During the Beth clone fight sequence in Bethic Twinstinct, staged as a parody of a Street Fighter-style tournament, one of the combatants is named Kick Puncher, which happens to be the exact name of the fictional action movie franchise that Troy and Abed, two characters on Community, treat as their favorite series throughout that show's run. It's a small, specific nod planted for anyone who happened to watch both shows closely enough to catch a joke this narrow. And Season 9's premiere reportedly does something the show has never done before with one of its oldest running habits, retiring, in a single line of dialogue, its long pattern of inventing increasingly ridiculous, silly one-off character and place names, a gag that had already grown noticeably rarer through Season 8 before getting explicitly sunset here. It's a small, self-aware moment of a series acknowledging one of its own oldest ticks out loud rather than just letting it fade from use unremarked, closing out a running joke that had, by that point, been a franchise staple since some of its earliest episodes. It's worth clearing up one piece of terminology that gets muddled in casual conversation, because two very differently named pieces of Vindicators material actually exist, and they aren't the same thing. Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender, is the title of a fictional in-universe superhero team-up special that the series depicts and references as existing within its own fictional world, not something Adult Swim produced and released to real audiences. Vindicators 2, on the other hand, is a real, actually produced Adult Swim web series, 10 episodes long, that dropped in full on July 23rd of 2022, confusing the two, treating the fictional in-show special as though it were a real, released piece of Adult Swim content. Is an easy mistake to make given how similar the names sound, but it's worth keeping the distinction straight. Underneath a lot of the show's stranger premises sits real science, exaggerated and dramatized for comedy, but rooted in ideas that actually exist outside the writer's room. And it's worth pulling a few of these threads out on their own, because they change how a rewatch lands once you know what's being dramatized underneath the joke. A Rickle in Time, the Frozen Time Season 2 premiere, already covered earlier in this video, for how badly its production went, is explicitly built around a dramatized version of Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. The real physics idea that you cannot simultaneously know both a particle's exact position and its exact momentum with total precision. The episode takes that idea and runs it through a family sitcom lens, splitting reality into observed and unobserved branches that behave differently depending on whether anyone's looking, which is a fairly faithful, if heavily simplified, dramatization of a genuine and famously counterintuitive piece of quantum theory. Rick Potion number 9, back in Season 1, leans on a different real-world framing, this time from behavioral science rather than physics. Rick's justification for treating a love potion as pure pharmacology rather than magic rests on describing love itself as a series of chemical reactions, a line that echoes almost verbatim how some behavioral scientists have actually described romantic attraction as a cascade of measurable brain chemistry rather than anything more mystical. Rick isn't inventing a cynical worldview out of nowhere in that episode. He's paraphrasing an actual, if reductive, scientific framing of what love is and using it to justify some of his worst behavior in the whole series, turning a real scientific idea into an excuse for reckless intervention in his daughter's life. Pickle Rick draws on real, if heavily exaggerated, science as well. The premise of Pickle Rick hijacking a cockroach's nervous system to build himself a crude, mobile body rests on a real, if dramatized, fact insect nervous systems really can be externally manipulated and controlled through targeted stimulation, a real area of study that researchers have actually demonstrated in limited, much less cinematic forms than what the episode depicts. The show takes a genuine, if niche, area of neuroscience and pushes it about as far into science fiction as it can go, while still keeping one foot in something a viewer could actually go look up afterward and find a kernel of truth in. And underneath all of it, holding its entire multiverse structure together, sits the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. The real scientific idea that our universe is just one branch on a constantly splitting tree of realities, with every possible outcome of every quantum event spinning off its own separate branch somewhere. Rick and Morty takes that interpretation and treats it as completely, literally true as its founding structural conceit, building the central finite curve, infinite Ricks, infinite Mortys, and the entire portal gun premise directly on top of it. That's an unusual choice for a mainstream animated comedy to make. Most shows that want a multiverse just wave their hands and invoke alternate dimensions as an unexamined premise. This one picked an actual, named scientific interpretation, one that's still disputed among physicists as an interpretation rather than a proven fact, and built its entire back half of a decade's worth of storytelling directly on top of it, treating a real, contested piece of theoretical physics as settled, load-bearing fictional law. Titles on this show are rarely just puns, and a handful of episodes stack far more reference material underneath their premise than a first watch would ever reveal. Something Rick This Way Comes from Season 1 is a good example of just how deep this can go. The title itself comes directly from Ray Bradbury's novel Something Wicked This Way Comes, and the episode's devil-adjacent antagonist. Misty, Needful, is visually modeled on Mr. Dark, the villain from the 1983 film adaptation of that same Bradbury book. The shop sign above Needful's store is set in It's Bengiat, the specific typeface famously associated with Stephen King's Dust Jackets, which ties the shop's name, Needful Things, directly to a King novel that shares that title. Layer 3 of the same episode, the individual cursed products sold inside the shop reference specific classic Twilight Zone episodes, A Game of Pool, Living Doll, and Printer's Devil among them. That's 4 distinct reference layers: Bradbury's novel, its film adaptation's villain design, a King novel's title borrowed for a shop name, and multiple individual Twilight Zone premises, all stacked into roughly 22 minutes of television built around a joke about Rick opening a rival business next door to the actual devil. Other episodes wear their references more lightly, but no less specifically. Raising Gazorpazorp, from that same first season, names its alien planet and species after Zardoz, the 1974 science fiction film starring Sean Connery. A reference specific enough that it functions almost as a dare to the audience to catch it, rather than a broad gesture at old sci-fi movies in general. Night Sham Aliens. A few episodes later, builds both its title and its nested simulation structure as a direct parody of filmmaker M. Night Shyamalan's signature twist ending style, turning an entire episode's plot mechanics into an extended joke about one specific director's reputation. And Rick Morai Jack, the season 5 finale, carries a visual reference beyond its fairly obvious Samurai Jack title pun. A shot of a young Rick in a trench coat sharing a bowl of noodles with Bird Person at a street-side bar recreates, almost shot for shot, the iconic ramen stand scene from Blade Runner, released in 1982, folding one of science fiction cinema's most recognizable images into a quiet character moment between two old friends. Autoerotic Assimilation, Season 2's Unity episode, has one of the more specific origin pitches on record for how a parody concept actually got greenlit. Unity, the hive mind entity Rick has an on and off relationship with across the episode, is an explicit parody of Star Trek's The Borg, and the writers have described pitching the concept internally with a single, blunt framing. What if Captain Picard had the hots for the Borg? That's the entire premise in one sentence, reframing one of Star Trek's most menacing antagonist forces as a literal ex-girlfriend Rick can't quite let go of. A pitch specific and strange enough that it's worth knowing the writers themselves described it in exactly those terms, rather than something more sanitized for the trade press. Even the show's most recognizable catchphrase turns out to have a real-world origin most viewers would never guess. Wubba lubba dub dub, first spoken in Season 1's Me Seeks and Destroy, wasn't written on the page as clean, scripted dialogue meant to read a specific way out loud. Justin Roiland has said he largely ad-libbed the sound in the booth, and fans and interviewers have long speculated that its rhythm and tone echo the kind of crowd-whooping noise you would hear from an old late-night talk show audience, though where it actually came from has never been pinned down with real certainty. And it went on to become one of its most quoted lines, printed on shirts and mugs and tattooed on actual fans. None of this exists without the people actually drawing it, and it's worth spending a little time on the studio and the money behind the series rather than only the writing. Rick and Morty's animation has been handled across its entire run by Bardell Entertainment, a studio based in Vancouver whose own portfolio confirms it as the animating house behind every season from the first through at least the 8th. Industry cost roundups have put the per-episode budget somewhere between roughly $1.2 million and $1.5 million. Though it's worth flagging clearly that this figure comes from general entertainment industry estimates rather than any official disclosure from Adult Swim or Warner Bros. Discovery, so it should be read as a rough industry estimate rather than a confirmed studio figure. Rick and Morty's production timeline had one especially rough patch worth naming directly: the gap between seasons 3 and 4, which Dan Harmon has attributed specifically to protracted contract negotiations with Adult Swim rather than any creative or animation bottleneck. Harmon said on record at the time that the delay would never be this long again, and the production side backed that promise up structurally rather than just rhetorically. After the 70-episode renewal locked in, the writers began scripting Season 5 before Season 4 had even finished airing, specifically, according to Harmon, to force the series to commit to a steadier production schedule going forward rather than falling back into the boom and bust release pattern that had defined its first several years. Rick and Morty's physical shelf presence extends well beyond the episodes themselves. The Art of Rick and Morty, Volume 1, collects unseen production art from its first 2 seasons, storyboards and design work that was never otherwise made publicly available outside that book. A second volume followed, published by Dark Horse in partnership with Adult Swim, covering seasons 3 and 4 as a separate, distinct release from the first volume, with its deluxe edition, including a glow-in-the-dark lithograph and a replica bumper sticker prop. Physical objects packaged specifically for the kind of collector willing to pay extra for tangible pieces of a cartoon's production history. Adult Swim has also, on at least one occasion, taken the show into live action entirely, in a deliberate wink back toward its own point of origin. A series of official promo shorts cast Christopher Lloyd, Doc Brown himself, from the actual Back to the Future trilogy, as a live-action Rick Sanchez, with a young actor playing a live-action Morty alongside him. Given everything this video has already covered about Rick and Morty's true origin as a crude Back to the Future parody made years before Rick and Morty existed as a title, casting the actual actor behind the character Doc and Marty was built to imitate is about as direct and self-aware a piece of franchise self-reference as this series has ever produced. One of those promos was captioned C132 by Adult Swim, a specific in-universe Rick designation that actually comes from a separate piece of extended universe material. The first 2 volumes of the Oni Press Rick and Morty comic line, tying a live-action marketing stunt back into yet another corner of this franchise's sprawling, semi-official expanded material. International broadcast timing tells its own small story about how its global footprint has tightened over the years. For most of its run, international broadcasters lagged behind the American premiere by anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks, but by most accounts starting with season 6, the UK's E4 moved to airing the season's opening episode as a same-day simulcast in the very early hours of the following morning, the first time that channel had matched the American broadcast this closely rather than trailing behind it. Its popularity in Japan has followed an unusual, somewhat lopsided path of its own. The Japanese dub of the flagship series only ever covered the first 3 seasons, despite its popularity there continuing to grow, a popularity substantial enough that it led directly to an entirely separate spin-off, Rick and Morty, the anime, animated by the Japanese studio Production 1G rather than Bardell, a different creative pipeline built specifically to serve an audience the flagship dub apparently stopped chasing after season 3. Coverage of its Brazilian dubbing history exists too, though it rests more heavily on fan-maintained dubbing wikis than mainstream press coverage, so it's worth treating that specific corner of the international story with a slightly lighter degree of confidence than everything else in this video. A few smaller continuity threads are worth closing out before the last stretch of this video, because they show the writers planting jokes years apart and trusting the audience to eventually connect them without any on-screen signpost. Jerry's beekeeping hobby, established almost in passing in Primordius, gets picked back up much later when he complains about someone urinating on his lavender plants, specifically because, in his words, his bees need the lavender. A domestic, faintly absurd detail that only lands as a callback if you happen to remember a hobby introduced seasons earlier in a completely unrelated episode. Rick's transformation in Pickle Rick gets a similar quiet payoff, with Jerry referencing it in later dialogue long after the episode itself has aired, treating it as established shared family history rather than something that needs re-explaining every time it comes up. And Mr. Goldenfold, the recurring background character, established as having a habit of eating out of the garbage, turns up later among Dr. Wong's patients, shown improving after briefly having been turned into a fly himself, a background gag that only clicks into place if the viewer remembers his poop eating habit from several seasons earlier and connects it to the fly transformation as an ironic bit of narrative symmetry. One more connection is worth including specifically because it's the kind fans have noticed and pieced together themselves rather than something confirmed by anyone who worked on either show. A portal escape gag in Season 1's Rick Counters episode, where a notebook, a mug, and a pen fly out of a portal in quick succession, bears a striking resemblance to a nearly identical gag in the Gravity Falls episode Society of the Blind Eye, which aired several months later, where a character loses the same 3 items into a portal he's in the process of building. Fans and trivia trackers have flagged the similarity for years, generally attributing it to shared crew or industry overlap between the 2 productions rather than any officially confirmed collaboration between the 2. Nobody involved with either series has gone on record explaining the overlap, so this one stays filed under fan-observed coincidence rather than confirmed cross-show reference, worth knowing about, but not worth repeating as settled fact. Which brings this video back around to a fairly literal reading of its own title, because official deleted scenes really do exist for this show, distributed through the channels a normal television production actually uses, DVD and Blu-ray bonus content, official studio YouTube uploads, the ordinary paper trail a released, finished piece of footage leaves behind, rather than the murkier, unconfirmed territory of abandoned production or leaked development art. Season 1's home releases include an extended version of what fans call the Rick dance sequence, along with a separate cutscene involving a broken television, both officially released bonus content rather than fan speculation. Season 3 went further, with Adult Swim distributing a dedicated deleted scenes playlist through its own official YouTube channel, a direct first-party archive of material that didn't make the broadcast cut, but that the network chose to release publicly anyway, rather than letting it disappear entirely. Rick's Minutes, back in Season 1, lost some of its interdimensional cable material, specifically because the episode had more parody segments written than it could fit. 2 of the cut bits would have parodied Seinfeld and The Young and the Restless, sitting alongside the surreal, absurdist cable surfing gags that did make the final cut. A reminder that even a segment as structurally loose and modular as interdimensional cable, which reads on screen like it could theoretically run forever, still had to get trimmed down to a broadcast-length runtime like everything else the series produces. One of Rick and Morty's alternate universe interdimensional cable segments carried a considerably darker unused ending than what actually aired. The material involving the C500A universe, documented in trivia sourcing tied to the episode, apparently considered a crueler final beat, that universe's version of Rick freezing that universe's version of Jerry, who then shatters after being hugged by that universe's Beth, a startlingly bleak, almost horror movie image for a segment that otherwise plays as background channel surfing filler. It's worth sitting with how different that alternate beat is in tone from nearly everything else in that same scene. A flash of genuine cruelty considered, and then apparently pulled back from before the episode locked its final cut. Even Rick and Morty's fictional in-universe cartoons, the parody shows it invents purely to satirize other media, went through their own developmental churn before locking into their broadcast form. Ball Fondlers, the crude cartoon within the cartoon that recurs as a running gag across multiple episodes, was originally conceived around a considerably more elaborate premise, styled after Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles as filtered through a wombat-themed parody, where the heroes derived their powers specifically from groping their own testicles. That's a much more constructed, high-concept premise than the crude single-image joke the finished version of Ball Fondlers actually runs on screen, and it's a useful reminder that even its laziest seeming in-universe parody content went through genuine conceptual development before the writers settled on the blunter, simpler version that reached broadcast. Put everything in this video next to each other, and a pattern starts to emerge that has less to do with any single deleted joke or recast voice, and more to do with how unusual Rick and Morty's relationship with its own history actually is. Most long-running television productions treat their production history as something to protect. A tidy origin myth repeated at panels, a handful of pre-approved anecdotes recycled across a decade of press junkets, everything else locked in a vault nobody outside the writer's room ever sees. Rick and Morty's own creators have instead spent years handing pieces of that vault directly to journalists, on commentary tracks, in interviews, at Comic-Con panels, seemingly without much concern for whether the messier version undercuts the show's reputation. Dan Harmon telling a reporter that a season's frozen time premiere might be the worst episode the show ever made. Roiland admitting, on the record, that a network almost fired him from his own creation over a voice performance, character designers naming the rat centaur, and the Bioshock hybrid they threw out before Pickle Rick ever looked like a pickle. None of that is information a studio's marketing department would volunteer if it had a choice in the matter. And yet here it all is, scattered across a decade of interviews, Blu-ray extras, and panel footage for anyone willing to go looking for it. That openness cuts both ways though, and it's worth being honest about the one place where it stops. The 2019 abandoned episode is the clearest exception in this entire video, a genuine, on-the-record confirmed piece of its history that both creators have simply refused to elaborate on, year after year, interview after interview, even when doing so would have been an easy, fan-pleasing answer to hand over. A show this willing to admit its Season 2 premiere nearly broke the writing staff, this willing to let a director talk through crashed animation software on a commentary track, drawing one hard line around exactly one piece of unfinished footage and holding it for this long says something about how deliberate the rest of the openness actually is. It isn't that Harmon and Roiland can't keep a secret, it's that they've mostly chosen not to, except for this one specific thing. None of the individual pieces covered across this video change how any single episode plays on a rewatch. Not really. Knowing that Pickle Rick's sewer rats were deliberately designed to look unlikable doesn't alter the scene where Rick tears through them for spare parts. Knowing the Citadel of Ricks was retroactively built around C-137's own killing spree doesn't change how the Rickshank Rickdemption actually unfolds on screen. What all of it adds up to, instead, is a fuller picture of how much material, how many discarded jokes and abandoned character designs and reworked storylines and scrapped bathroom-themed subplots borrowed from an entirely different show gets generated and thrown away for every single finished episode that actually reaches a screen. The version of Rick and Morty available to stream right now is the product of an enormous amount of material that never made it, and that ratio, however common it might be across television production generally, is rarely laid out this specifically for any other show still airing new episodes today. Worth remembering, too, is that this isn't a franchise looking back from retirement. Everything cataloged across this video, the recast cold open, the abandoned 2019 episode, the redubbed baby version of Total Rickle, the Hong Kong protest codes, sits inside a show that is still actively being produced, still generating new deleted scenes and new commentary track confessions with every season it releases. Season 8 aired across May and July of 2025. Season 9 followed the next year, taking the total episode count to 981 by its own finale. Adult Swim's commitment to a 12th season, confirmed at that 2024 Comic-Con panel, means there's a real, non-speculative reason to expect this list to keep growing rather than closing off into a fixed, finished body of work the way a canceled show's history eventually does. Whatever gets cut from Season 10, whatever joke gets rewritten between a Season 11 broadcast and its eventual streaming rerun, whatever detail some future Blu-ray commentary reveals about a scene that didn't survive the edit, none of that exists yet, which means a video like this one is really just a progress report rather than a final accounting. That ongoing quality changes how to think about a title like Lost Episodes for a show in this position. For a canceled series, the phrase points backward toward a fixed, closed set of things that will never get made, a permanent absence. For Rick and Morty, sitting comfortably renewed years into the future, it points somewhere closer to the present tense, describing an ongoing, active practice this production engages in constantly, generating more material than it airs, rewriting jokes between broadcasts, admitting outright, every so often, that a whole episode simply didn't survive contact with its own production schedule. The show's actual first version of itself, that 2006 Channel 101 short with the deliberately misspelled names, was itself a kind of lost episode long before Rick and Morty existed as a title at all, and everything since has just kept adding to the same growing pile of material that got made, reworked, cut, redubbed, or swapped out unannounced somewhere between one broadcast and the next. One last piece of housekeeping is worth doing before closing out, because this video has already touched, in passing, on comics and spin-offs that sit outside the flagship animated series, and it's worth being precise about which of those actually count as part of the story this show is telling. The Oni Press comic line, referenced earlier through that C132 designation stamped on one of the Christopher Lloyd live-action promos, and the separate I Do comic run, are both licensed expanded universe material rather than scripts written or overseen by the flagship show's own writer's room. That distinction matters concretely. Doofus Jerry, a variant of Jerry who occasionally shows up in fan discussion as though he were an established part of the animated show's world, actually originates entirely within the I Do comics, specifically issues 21 through 23 of that run, and has no basis in anything aired on Adult Swim. Comic-only material like this is generally treated as separate from the animated series' own continuity, interesting as licensed side content, but not something a Rick and Morty lore video should present as though Rick, Morty, or anyone else on the actual show has ever encountered him. Justin Roiland's other animated series, Solar Opposites, invites a similar kind of caution, though for a slightly different reason. Roiland has said in interviews that he likes to think of Rick and Morty and Solar Opposites as existing within the same broader multiverse, and the two shows do plant small, deliberate Easter eggs referencing each other. Posters and billboards that a sharp-eyed viewer of one show can occasionally spot inside the other, but that's the extent of it. There is no official crossover episode, no confirmed shared canon status beyond those winks, and practically speaking, a formal crossover would run into real corporate obstacles anyway, since the two shows are produced by different, competing companies. Rick and Morty, under Warner Bros. Discovery's Adult Swim umbrella, Solar Opposites, under 20th Television for Hulu, now itself owned by Disney, treat the connection as an affectionate homage between two shows made by some of the same creative people, not as evidence the two properties actually share a timeline. Rick and Morty, the anime occupies its own separate lane entirely, animated by the Japanese studio Production 1G rather than Bardell Entertainment, and produced specifically to serve the audience built up by the flagship show's popularity in Japan, a popularity substantial enough to justify an entirely separate animated adaptation using different animators, a different visual style, and presumably its own creative decisions made somewhat independently of Bardell's ongoing work on the main series. None of this expanded material is fake or somehow illegitimate. Comics, spin-offs, and international co-productions are a completely normal part of how a franchise this large operates commercially. It's just worth keeping straight which parts of it were written by the people actually steering Rick and Morty's own continuity, and which parts exist a step or two removed from that, however officially licensed, and however much fun they might be on their own terms. A video built around lost and hidden material inevitably runs into rumors that sound plausible but don't actually hold up once you go looking for a real source behind them, and it's worth naming a few of those directly rather than pretending they don't circulate. Claims of a specific Rick and Morty episode formerly banned in Poland or in Russia show up periodically in fan discussion, but no properly sourced account of either country banning a specific named episode turned up anywhere in the research behind this video. What does actually exist in that broader territory is more mundane, general content moderation friction, gaps in regional dubbing, and streaming licensing changes that followed several companies exiting the Russian market after 2022, none of which amounts to a single episode being formally banned the way the rumor usually implies. Treat any specific band in this exact country claim about this show with real skepticism until it comes with an actual, checkable source attached. A separate, more specific rumor holds that Adult Swim once scrapped a full Vindicators 3 anime special distinct from anything the series actually produced, but that claim doesn't hold up either once you separate out what's real. What's real is the produced content already covered earlier in this video. The Vindicators 2 web series that, as far as the record shows, Adult Swim did put out as an actual release, and the fictional in-universe Vindicators 3, The Return of Worldender, which it depicts and references within its own story, but never produced as a real, standalone special for audiences to watch. No corroborated account of some third, separate, scrapped anime-style production exists beyond those two confirmed pieces. So that particular rumor appears to be exactly that. A rumor built from mashing two real things together into a third thing that was never actually in development. And a formally pitched, formally rejected Mr. Poopy Butthole spinoff, an idea that comes up fairly often given how beloved the character is, doesn't have a documented real pitch behind it either. What exists instead is plenty of speculative fan and critic wish listing, the kind of they should really give him his own show commentary that trails any popular side character on any long-running series, but nothing on record describing an actual pitch meeting, a script, or a formal rejection from the network. It's the kind of claim that's easy to believe precisely because it sounds like exactly the kind of project and network this willing to greenlit a full baby-voiced redub of Total Rickle might plausibly have considered. But plausible isn't the same as confirmed, and this video would rather leave a gap unfilled than hand you an invented detail dressed up as fact. If a real, sourced pitch for that spin-off ever surfaces, it'll be worth its own separate video. Until then, it stays exactly where it belongs, in the same pile as the Poland ban and the Phantom anime special, plausible-sounding fan wish fulfillment rather than documented studio history. There's something fitting about a show this preoccupied with alternate versions of itself. Infinite Ricks, Infinite Mortis, a Beth who might be the clone or might not be, a Jerry who turned out to be the wrong Jerry all along, also turning out to have its own quiet stack of alternate versions sitting behind the episodes that actually aired, a cold open with a runaway garage dinosaur instead of the one you know, a Morty voiced with more whine and less spine than the one that made it to broadcast, a whole finished episode nobody outside two people has ever seen, and that both of them have decided, for years now, to keep to themselves. None of that undercuts the show sitting on your watch list right now. If anything, it does the opposite, because a franchise this comfortable admitting what didn't work, what got cut, what got recast, what got rewritten between one print and the next without so much as a press release, is a franchise confident enough in what did make it to air to let the failures sit out in the open too. Rick and Morty started as a favor to nobody, a cheap parody short that by most accounts ran into copyright trouble of its own, handed its family structure by a network executive, its lead vocal performance nearly taken away before the pilot even aired, and it has spent the years since turning into a closely analyzed, widely quoted fixture of adult animation, still airing new seasons, still generating new deleted scenes, and new commentary track confessions with every one of them. That's a strange arc for something that began this haphazardly, and it's part of why a compilation like this is possible at all. A decade and a half of interviews, Blu-ray extras, leaked cold opens, and coded background text, all adding up to a show that's been unusually honest about how much of itself never made it to your screen. Look back across everything this video actually covered, and the through line isn't really about Rick or Morty at all. It's about how much labor sits underneath 22 minutes of finished television, the writer's room fights nobody sees, the concept artists sketching monsters that never make it past a single meeting, the network executives whose notes reshape a whole family structure before a single frame gets animated. That labor doesn't disappear once an episode airs. It just goes quiet, filed away in a Blu-ray extra or a decade-old interview transcript, waiting for someone to go dig it back up. This video was one attempt at that kind of digging, built entirely out of things Harmon, Roiland, Martyr, and the rest of the crew have already said publicly. Nothing invented, nothing filled in to sound more impressive than the record actually supports. Because a show this openly self-critical about its own production history deserves a video that holds itself to the same standard, flagging a theory as a theory, a rumor as unconfirmed, and a real, sourced fact as exactly that and nothing more. There's a reasonable chance you didn't make it through all of that awake. And that's fine. That's actually the whole design of these slow midnight uploads. Long-form lore told slowly, at this deliberate pace, and in this low, even register, isn't really built for someone sitting forward taking careful notes. It's built for exactly the opposite. For a mind that's already loosening its grip on the details, letting the facts blur together into a low, steady hum in the background, while the body does the actual work of falling asleep. If a name or a date or a season number slipped past somewhere in the middle, that's not a failure on your part. That's just what happens somewhere around the point where a show's fictional multiverse and your own half-formed dreams start to overlap a little, the two blurring together until neither one is entirely distinguishable from the other anymore. Thanks for spending this stretch of the night with all of it. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.